Matt Continetti joins me. He's a columnist for the Washington Free Beacon. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's in my ear most days because he's a contributor to the commentary pod. And Matt, I got you for 4 segments or so, so I want to be getting light. Wegmans versus Balducci's.
Oh, Wegmans, absolutely. I mean,
Oh,
Balducci's, I'm a man of the people, Hugh. So Balducci's it's a little bit too elitist for me. Wegmans, that's you go and you can find it everywhere in Red America, and the prepared food section out of this world. So yeah, Wegmans over Balducci's.
well, I'm a Balducci's guy because they make sandwiches, and when the fetching Mrs. Hewitt is out of town, they make great sandwiches. I don't know if Wegmans
They
makes
do.
sandwiches. They do. Okay, well, it's closer then. So that's it. Number two. Your column today, in part reads, the document's broad language, the OMB document, resulted in confusion. Democrats stoked the outrage. A federal judge enjoined the order, et cetera, et cetera. You do not mention who the judge is, how long the judge has served, or who appointed her. And do you know any of those things?
I believe it was a liberal judge, but I don't know any more
A
than
Joe Biden judge appointed in 2023 who
Right.
passed by a 51 to 50 vote, including the vice president. So controversial. She lost a couple of Democrats. I bring this up not because that's relevant. It isn't to me. A federal district court judge, but whenever we read about Judge Eileen Cannon, check me on this, rebuke me if I'm wrong. We always knew she was a Trump judge without many years of experience on the bench, right? Wasn't that always
Oh,
part of the
absolutely.
story?
Yes, absolutely. Or if there's a Reagan appointee who rules against Trump, then you'll always hear the Reagan appointee decided that Donald Trump had gone too far this time. But in this case, yes, the identity of the court of the judge who enjoined the OMB memo uh, was left out of most coverage. It was in enough coverage that I was able to pull out of my hat, Hugh, that it was a liberal judge, but I didn't know more than that.
Well, the reason I just say that it's so ridiculous. The narrative generators in legacy media always tell you name, age, rank, serial file of the judge when it advances their narrative. And when it doesn't advance their narrative, it's just a judge. And I just think it's absurd and indicts legacy media. Third, not significant thing, then before we get to the significant thing, Emily Wilson's The Odyssey. All right, you guys sold me on this. I love The Odyssey. I was stunned to hear nobody knows what it is. I was stunned by your education statistics. A third of American eighth graders are illiterate. But my eyebrows went up. Christopher Nolan's making the movie. Adam told me about that 2 days ago. I'm very excited because I love The Odyssey. So I went to see Emily Wilson. I wanted to get an audiobook because I listen to audiobook. It's read by Claire Danes. What do you make of that choice?
I think it's an interesting choice. I like Claire Danes movies. We recently celebrated the anniversary of Igby Goes Down, a movie she made, gosh, about 20 some years ago with Kieran Culkin. So I get that. I have not read this Wilson translation of the Odyssey. That was recommended by my colleague and major domo, John Podhoretz. But he says once you get past the very PC introduction, it's a good read.
Yeah,
And
the
I
Odyssey
might
is
take him up on it.
gendered. The Odyssey is full of toxic
Right.
masculinity. Well, the Odyssey is for warriors. There are some women, Penelope, the sirens, the witch, for whom a woman's voice would be right. But don't you think the Odyssey ought to be read by a man?
Yeah, yeah. Homer was a man, of course, and he's the one who recited it to begin with. I guess there's some historical continuity, but I guess maybe it's because I'm a squish shoe. I'm always open to creative interpretation, so I'm going to let
I
this one slip
I
by.
didn't buy the book. I was prepared to buy the book, and I like Claire Danes, but I said no. The Odyssey should be read in the voice of Odysseus or Ulysses. I'll be right back. Back with Matt Continetti during the break from the Salem News Channel and my Salem affiliates. Matt, I just had Dan Crenshaw on. I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to ask Ben Domenech, Jim Talent, Jim Garrity. Who are America's enemies? And by that I mean an enemy wants to destroy you, disable you, debilitate you, or in some way damage you. Who are our enemies and who are the most important enemies, the most threatening enemies?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, we have many enemies. You look at the openly adversarial regimes, the Islamic Republic of Iran, views us as the big Satan ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. It's pursuing nuclear weapons. It has caused chaos throughout its region and beyond. It's currently organizing plots to assassinate U.S. officials, including President Trump. The other adversarial regime is the People's Republic of North Korea. Now we have a ceasefire in place in the war since 1953, but that war, in which many Americans died, has not actually concluded. And the DPRK as well has nuclear weapons and is now attempting to create an ICBM that could reach the continental United States. Then there's the terrorist threat from ISIS and Al Qaeda and the various radical Islamic militants. And then you kind of have the competitors, the great power competitors, Hugh, our adversaries. The most powerful is the People's Republic of China. And then I also believe Vladimir Putin's Russia is antagonistic toward America and American interests and values. So that's kind of the landscape. And there are smaller powers, Maduro in Venezuela, the remnants of the Castro regime in Cuba. But I'd say that the big ones are Iran, North Korea, and then China and Russia.
All right, now, Congressman Crenshaw used everyone on your list. He said we can't categorize them number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because there's a threat matrix. I get that, but I'm trying to drive home. China is our number one enemy. And this DeepSeek thing was a complete, you called it an information operation. That's exactly what it was. But those of us who are old enough to remember the Soviets know what that is. And one of my law students actually had downloaded it before I could stop them. And I said, what? Hello, spy, come into my house. And they don't get it. But Dan Crenshaw also added the cartels. And Donald Trump's imposing tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China, in part because of the cartels, in part because of fentanyl and immigration. I think he is right to use tariffs under his commander-in-chief power. We have a minute to break. What do you think? I think he has tariff power under his commander-in-chief power. We have 30 seconds till we go back on. What do you think?
Yeah, tariffs for national security do fall under his powers, and he's using his tariffs as leverage in order to force Mexico and Canada to crack down on fentanyl traffic and illegal migration. So it's an appropriate use of his power. And the cartels are an enemy of the United States, especially now that they've been designated as terrorist organizations by the Trump administration.
Now, when we come back from break, I'll pick up on terrorists and bollards in New Orleans because you brought that up, and I'd already forgotten about it, for goodness sake. Stand by, America.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show returns in 5 seconds.
Welcome back, America. Matt Continetti is back with me as he is every Friday. Now, we had a terrible tragedy in Washington, D.C., and that is not the action of an enemy. It is an incompetent action either by the pilot of the American Airlines, the pilot of the Black Hawk, or the air traffic control tower. One or all of those three, we won't know. We'll find out soon. But I want to point out, Americans are never our enemies. We can be in deep disagreement with them, but they are never our enemies unless they're treasonous sons of guns like Edward Snowden. That's an enemy. When you become a traitor to the United States, then you're an enemy. But the bollards in New Orleans that weren't fixed, the fire hydrants that went dry, and something that went wrong in the skies over Reagan National. There is a theory of brokenness which is gaining traction in my head, that the government is just broken. What do you think?
Well, these examples of government incompetence seem to be increasing. I mean, whether it is the situation in New Orleans prior to the terrorist attack on New Year's Day, or we're discussing the poor fire management policies and water policies and just general climate of DEI and wokery in Los Angeles prior to the wildfires. And now we have this terrible accident above the Potomac River with the civilian airliner and the Black Hawk helicopter. The competence is important. And this is why I think it's completely appropriate for President Trump to raise the issue of merit and whether we are hiring the best people for these various positions. Obviously, there's a whole lot to be discovered about what happened in Washington the other night. And there's a lot of painful emotions that people are going to have to work through as we continue to recover and identify the victims of this accident. But we also need to make sure that we have competent individuals, the best people. I think that makes sense. And if you don't have that, then you are going to have kind of a culture where things just slide. And that's what we don't want that in the United States of America. We're better than that.
And that goes in the category of difficulties we have as a result of politics that do not make the people who created them our enemy. In another category, we got this weird story where the Vermont border guard was murdered by apparently a trans activist terrorist in league with other trans activist terrorists. There are enemies within, but they're few and far between, right? It's not the 60s. We haven't got a weather underground. We don't have a lot. I get we have Antifa and thing like that. Those are enemies of the public order. But I don't rank them on the level with China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, the cartels. Do you?
No, I mean the external threats are greater. I mean, I named those rogue states or in those great powers at the top of my list, Hugh, simply because they have access to the ultimate weapon. There is no greater threat than nuclear weapons, and the terrorist groups, of course, would love to have nuclear weapons as well, and that's why I kind of put them at a higher level. But there is an internal threat as well. Sometimes that's the cartels, a transnational threat, but then you also have to worry about lawlessness in the society. You have to maintain and exercise the rule of law and order in a society, unless you're going to have just again things slide, chaos and anarchy and murder. And I am troubled by a rise in political violence. That I have to say, there are examples on both sides, but
Yes.
there are quite a few examples on the left. There are more examples coming from the left recently than there are from the right. And when you consider as well the pro-Hamas sympathizers, the actions that they are taking on America's streets and on America's campuses, that is a threat. That's
They're enemies.
not just a threat to
They're
Jewish
enemies.
students. That's a threat of us all. This story that you're talking about in Vermont, and let's just also recall the reaction to Luigi Mangioni's terrorist killing
yes.
of the United Health CEO. And so I am slightly disturbed, especially when I look at survey data showing that younger Americans believe that Mangioni's murderous act was justified. That is something we have to worry about, as well as the national security threats that emanate from outside the United States.
So now the harder question is, what do we worry about the most? I went through the Hugh Hewitt hierarchy of trouble earlier in the program. There is anxiety and worry, and that really doesn't matter very much. Then there are problems, health issues, but not of the next category, crises, and then there are tragedies, which cannot be reversed. But in the hierarchy of trouble, China is our biggest I have behind my shoulder Tom Cotton's new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. They are a malevolent, evil actor on the world stage. And I don't know that Americans kind of get that, because I didn't even get it until 2014, until I figured out Xi is not Deng or not the previous 2 dictators. He's really a Leninist. He's really a bad guy. Do you think America understands that?
I don't think that we fully understand it, Hugh. I think we're beginning to understand it. I think the Special Committee on China was a beginning of people recognizing it. I do think the law forcing the sale of TikTok was another sign that people recognize what China is up to, especially in the tech space. I think at the level of military readiness, we're beginning to recognize that we have to expand the Navy. We have to reinvigorate our defense industrial base if we're going to keep up with China. And the way I see it, just briefly, is the way to strengthen ourselves in relation to these enemies in relation to a great power competitor like the People's Republic of China is to strengthen our home. That's why we need energy dominance. That's why we need to release the animal spirits in our economy. That's why we need to do everything we can with light touch regulation to promote technological innovation. Everything that grows from that is going to strengthen America's natural advantages, which we already have, and lead to innovation that will translate into a qualitative military edge. So I start with our energy sources, and then I think you use those to build out a strong economy, a strong military, and technology that the enemy cannot match.
And when we come back, I'm going to talk with Matt one more segment off air, and we'll put it on the podcast, about Doug Burgum, the new Secretary of the Interior, who is also now not only chair of the National Energy Council, but has a seat on the National Security Council, which is a very good thing for the reason Matt just referenced. And if you want to hear all of, you'll have to go to my YouTube channel or listen to the podcast today. Stay tuned. I am back with Matt Continetti for a couple more minutes. Matt, I'm always smiling when you at the Commentary Podcast give props to Doug Burgum. I've only met him once, 2.5, 3-hour dinner with Michael Waltz, which at that time they didn't know they'd be working together. And I learned more about carbon capture, energy production, AI, small modular reactors in 2 hours from Doug Burgum than I had learned in my 67 years. I think he's fabulous and is key to this whole thing. What do you think?
Oh, I love the guy, as you know, if you listen to the Commentary Podcast.
But I don't know if it's because of the merch or the guy. You love the merch.
No. For me, it's the guy, because you talk about what you learned about small modular reactions from Governor Burgum. I learned about city planning and road building and highways and urban development. And then in another conversation, I learned more about drug policy and addiction than I had before.
Really?
I think he should just have a position. I'm glad he's on the National Security Council, Hugh, but I also think he should just have like kind of a swivel chair near President Trump, so that whenever Trump has a question about something, and he enjoys Doug Burgum's company because Burgum campaigned with him quite a bit in 2024, you get so much insight. And so it's very important that he be on the National Security Council as they pursue this strategy of energy dominance, leading eventually to America's furthering our qualitative military edge. And I also think that his counterpart, the incoming Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, will only amplify the insight into energy markets, into how to extract the most from our natural resources. Also, the way that we tackle permitting, Hugh, so that we can strengthen the grid. It's one thing to create the power, but you also then have to move it, right? And liberals and environmentalists, of course, want to prevent that from happening. So these are two great picks by President Trump. And I think that they're actually at the center of the strategy to pursue a new American golden age, because you cannot have an economy, you cannot have civilization without bountiful, cheap energy. And one more point. Our enemies, as we started this discussion, often they sit on energy resources, and they use those resources to manipulate world affairs in their malign direction.
You're absolutely right,
best
Matt.
Way,
energy is
to undercut
freedom.
Russia.
Yeah.
Is cheap energy.
Russia's Saudi Arabia with trees. And the fact of the matter is, energy is freedom. Matt Continetti, always great to talk to you on a Friday. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll be right back, America.